The cup shook in Illyra's hand, but her face stayed calm. Around her, hundreds of pack members stood in silence, waiting for the words that would decide her fate. She could feel their eyes on her skin like small needles. She did not look away from them. She did not cry. She simply stood at the center of the stone courtyard, her long brown hair moving gently in the cold wind, and waited for Cade to speak. Cade stood on the raised platform above her, dressed in black, his jaw tight, his golden eyes hard as stone. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the Ashwood Pack, a man feared across every territory for his strength and his temper. Just hours ago, something inside him had shifted the moment their eyes met for the first time. A pull, a warmth, a voice deep inside him had whispered one word: mate. He had felt it click into place, a bond stronger than anything he had known before. But instead of joy, panic had taken over. He could not trust a bond that had appeared out of nowhere, not when his closest advisor had just shown him documents claiming that a woman, matching Illyra's description, had been seen near the enemy camp of the Blackthorn Pack 3 nights earlier. She cannot be trusted, his advisor, a sharp-eyed man named Callan, had whispered in his ear only an hour before. Mate or not, my king, you cannot risk the safety of thousands for a woman you have known for one day. Cade had wanted to argue. Some part of him had wanted to pull her close, instead of pushing her away. But a king who had lost his own parents to betrayal from someone they trusted did not have the luxury of soft feelings. He had built his entire rule on one rule alone: trust must be earned, never assumed. So he had done the one thing his instincts screamed against. He had rejected her. In front of the entire pack, in a voice loud enough to reach every ear in the courtyard, he had said the words that severed a mate bond forever. He watched something break behind Illyra's eyes when he said it, a flicker of pain so deep it made his own chest ache in response. But she had not screamed, not begged, not fallen to her knees the way some might expect. She had only closed her eyes for one long breath, then opened them again, calm as still water. That calmness had bothered him more than tears ever could have. Now, only a day later, she stood before him again, this time accused of something far worse than simply being a stranger who had shown up at the wrong time. Someone had poisoned part of the water supply near the eastern training grounds. 2 young wolves had fallen sick. A guard swore he had seen a woman matching Illyra's exact description near the well the night before the sickness began. Illyra had not been given a chance to explain much. The moment the accusation reached Cade's ears, old wounds inside him reopened, wounds from years ago, when someone close to his family had poisoned his father slowly, over the course of a year, until nothing could be done to save him. The word poison alone was enough to turn Cade's blood cold. "Do you deny it?" Cade asked her now, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Illyra lifted her chin. She had spent the entire night in a cold cell, given no food, only silence and time to think. She thought about the mate bond she had felt so briefly, the warmth that had disappeared the moment he called her a stranger, a possible enemy, a liar. She thought about how quickly he had chosen suspicion over her, without asking a single question, without giving her one chance to speak, before condemning her in front of everyone she might have called family. "I have nothing to deny," she said quietly, "because I have nothing to prove to a man who has already decided who I am." A murmur passed through the crowd. Cade's eyes narrowed, though something in his chest twisted painfully at her words. "That is not an answer," he said. "It is the only one you will get," Illyra replied. "You did not ask me who I am before you rejected me. You will not believe me now, no matter what I say." Cade stepped down from the platform, closing the distance between them until he stood only a few feet away. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the faint tremble in her hands that she was trying so hard to hide. Something inside him screamed that this was wrong, that she was not the enemy, that the pull he had felt the day before could not have been a mistake. But Callan's voice echoed in his mind, warning him again and again that emotions could not be trusted, that his father's downfall had started with exactly this kind of blind belief in someone who seemed harmless. "Where were you 2 nights ago?" Cade asked, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "Walking," Illyra said. "Alone, trying to understand what a mate bond even meant, since I had never felt one before. You rejected me within a single day of forming it." Her words landed like a blow. Cade felt his throat tighten, but his face remained hard, unreadable, the mask of a king who could not afford weakness in front of his people. "There were no witnesses to confirm that," he said. "Because I did not know I would need one," Illyra answered. "I did not know that walking alone at night was a crime in your territory." A few pack members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension between logic and something else entirely. Something raw and painful that had nothing to do with poison or water wells. Callan stepped forward from the side of the platform, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes held a flicker of satisfaction that no one but Illyra seemed to notice. "My king," Callan said smoothly, "the evidence is clear. The guard's account, her presence near the border, her connection to nothing, and no one in this pack. We cannot allow sentiment to put our people at risk." Cade's hands curled into fists at his sides. Every instinct in his body told him to trust the woman standing in front of him, yet everything he had been taught, everything he had built his rule upon, told him that instincts could be manipulated, that even mate bonds could be twisted by dark magic in times of war between packs. The Blackthorn pack had used forbidden methods before. It was not impossible that they had found a way to fake a bond in order to plant a spy directly beside him. He hated himself for even considering it. He hated himself more for how easily the thought took root. "Take her to the holding cell," Cade said finally, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "She will remain there until we determine the full truth." Two guards stepped forward to take Illyra by the arms. She did not resist. She simply looked at Cade one last time, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, any small crack in his decision. For a moment, she thought she saw it, a flicker of hesitation in those golden eyes, but then he turned away, his back straight, his expression cold, and the moment was gone. As the guards led her toward the holding cells beneath the castle, Illyra felt something inside her settle into a strange kind of peace. If he could turn away from her this easily, if he could believe a stranger's word over the truth she had spoken with her own voice, then perhaps the bond they shared meant nothing at all. Perhaps it was never meant to be trusted in the first place. She walked with her head held high, her steps steady, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Behind her, hidden in the shadows near the edge of the courtyard, a young woman named Wren watched everything unfold with a growing sense of unease. Wren worked as one of the pack's healers, and she had been the one called to check on the two sick wolves the night before. Something about their symptoms had never quite matched ordinary poison. The color of their skin, the pattern of the illness, the way it had spread so slowly, rather than all at once. All of it felt wrong, in a way she could not yet explain. She had tried to mention this to Callan earlier that morning, but he had brushed her concerns aside so quickly that it left her wondering if he had wanted the investigation to end before it truly began. Wren watched Illyra disappear into the castle, and a small knot of worry tightened in her stomach. She did not know this woman. She had no reason to trust her. But something about the calm acceptance on Illyra's face, as she walked toward her cell, did not look like the guilt of someone hiding a crime. It looked like the quiet grief of someone who had already lost the only thing she had ever truly wanted. Inside the cold stone cell, Illyra sat on the narrow bench, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. She thought about the moment their eyes had first met the day before, in the great hall during a gathering of nearby packs. She had traveled there with a small trading group from a distant village, never expecting anything more than a simple exchange of goods. When Cade had looked at her from across the room, she had felt her whole body come alive in a way she had never experienced before. The bond had formed instantly, undeniable, powerful, exactly the way the old stories described it. For one single, perfect moment, she had believed her life was about to change for the better. She had been wrong. Somewhere above her, in the private chambers of the castle, Cade stood alone by a tall window, staring out at the darkening sky. Callan had left him with reassurances that he had made the right choice, that a king could not allow personal feelings to endanger his entire pack. Yet the moment he was alone, the reassurances felt hollow, echoing emptily, in a room that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet. He pressed a hand against his chest, right over the place where the bond still pulsed faintly, a quiet reminder of a connection he had tried so hard to silence. It did not disappear simply because he had spoken cruel words in front of his pack. It lingered, stubborn and patient, waiting for him to acknowledge what his instincts had known from the very first moment their eyes had met. But acknowledging it now, after everything he had said and done, felt impossible. A king could not admit fear. A king could not admit that he might have made a terrible mistake, driven not by wisdom, but by old wounds that had never fully healed. So instead, Cade did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed the feeling down, buried it beneath duty and suspicion, and told himself that time would reveal the truth, one way or another. He did not yet know how right he was, or how much that truth would cost him. Down in the cell, as darkness settled fully over the castle, Alira closed her eyes and allowed herself, just once, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not anger. Not even sadness, exactly. Something quieter than that. A slow, aching acceptance that the life she had briefly imagined for herself, one filled with warmth and belonging, had ended before it had even truly begun. She did not know yet what the coming days would bring. She did not know about the silver poison waiting in her future, or the smile she would wear when she faced it. She only knew, in that cold and lonely cell, that she had already lost the one thing she never thought she would find. And somewhere above her, the man who had rejected her stood awake long into the night, haunted by a bond he refused to trust, unaware that his choice had already set in motion something that could never be undone. The screaming started before dawn. Alira woke to the sound of guards shouting through the corridor, their boots pounding against stone as they ran past her cell. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from the cold floor, and pressed her face against the small barred window of her cell door. Something had happened. Something bad enough to pull half the castle guard from their beds before sunrise. A guard rushed past, and she called out to him. "What is happening?" He barely glanced at her, his face pale with fear. Another wolf collapsed an hour ago. This time, it was one of the king's own personal guards. Alira's stomach dropped. If another wolf had fallen sick while she sat locked away with no access to water, no access to anyone, then the truth was becoming impossible to ignore, at least to anyone willing to look at it honestly. She was not the source of the sickness. She could not be. But she also knew, with a heavy certainty, that this new evidence would not necessarily help her. Fear made people desperate for someone to blame, and desperation rarely cared about logic. By mid-morning, she was pulled from her cell and marched back to the same courtyard where she had stood the day before. This time, the crowd was smaller, tighter, filled with tension that crackled in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Cade stood on the platform again, his face drawn and tired, dark circles beneath his golden eyes suggesting he had not slept at all. Callan stood beside him, and for the first time, Alira noticed something odd in the way he held himself. He stood a little too still, his eyes darting toward her only briefly before sliding away again, as if he could not quite meet her gaze. She filed the observation away, unsure yet what it meant. "A third wolf has fallen ill," Cade announced to the gathered crowd, his voice rough with exhaustion. This time, the prisoner was locked away with no access to the water source. This raises questions about the nature of this illness that we must address before fear spreads further through our pack. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alira felt a small flicker of hope stir in her chest, quickly followed by caution. Hope had betrayed her once already in this place. She would not let herself trust it so easily again. "I did not do this," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, despite its quiet steadiness. "I have said this from the beginning. Perhaps now, someone will consider that I was telling the truth." Cade's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe her. Every part of him, the part connected to her through a bond he still refused to name out loud, screamed at him to believe her. But a king who ruled through strength could not simply change his mind, because his heart wished it so, not without solid proof to stand behind his decision. "We will investigate the pattern of the illness," Cade said carefully. "Until we understand its true source, you will remain in custody." Alira's small flicker of hope dimmed, but did not fully disappear. At least now there was doubt. At least now someone besides herself questioned the official story. That doubt had a name, though neither Alira nor Cade knew it yet. Ren stood near the edge of the courtyard, watching the exchange with growing determination. She had spent the entire previous night studying the symptoms of all three sick wolves, comparing notes, checking old healing texts passed down through generations of pack healers. What she found troubled her deeply. The pattern of sickness did not match ordinary poison at all. It matched something far more specific, A rare herb, known as nightshade root, difficult to obtain, difficult to prepare correctly, and never something an outsider unfamiliar with pack territory could simply stumble upon by accident. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the land, the herbs, the timing. They knew how to make it look convincing enough to fool a grieving, suspicious king. Ren approached Callan later that day, hoping to share her findings, but something about his reaction made the knot of unease in her stomach tighten even further. He listened to her report with a carefully blank expression, thanked her for her diligence, and told her he would handle the information personally. He did not ask a single question. He did not seem curious at all about how she had reached her conclusions. A healer who had spent years reading people as carefully as she read symptoms, Ren recognized the signs of someone trying too hard to appear unbothered. She decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that she would keep investigating on her own. Meanwhile, in the private training grounds behind the castle, Cade paced back and forth, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He replayed every moment since Alira's arrival, searching for any detail that might explain the strange coincidences building against her, or perhaps in her favor, depending on how one chose to look at it. He thought about the way she had looked at him during their very first meeting, before any of this had happened, before suspicion had poisoned everything between them. There had been no calculation in her eyes then, no hidden agenda he could detect, only surprise and quiet wonder at the sudden bond forming between them. Spies did not usually wear expressions like that. Spies calculated, planned, controlled every reaction. What he had seen in her eyes had felt entirely, achingly real. But then again, perhaps that was exactly what a skilled spy would want him to believe. The uncertainty gnawed at him constantly, a low hum beneath every thought, every decision. He hated feeling this way, torn between instinct and duty, unable to trust his own judgment. His father had once told him that a true leader made decisions with a clear head, free from the fog of emotion. Yet here he stood, hopelessly tangled in exactly the kind of fog his father had warned him against. Later that evening, Cade made his way down to the holding cells himself, dismissing the guards so he could speak with Alira alone. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded, but not hostile, simply watchful, as though she had long ago run out of energy to waste on anger. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I want to understand," Cade said, his voice quieter than it had been in the courtyard, stripped of the hardness he wore in front of his pack. "I want to understand who you are, and why this bond formed the way it did, if it truly did." "You already rejected it," Alira said simply. "You already told your entire pack, and me, that it meant nothing." "I know what I said." Cade's hands tightened at his sides. "I am not certain anymore that it was the right thing to say." Something in Alira's chest ached at his words. A painful mixture of hope and fear tangled so tightly together that she could not separate one from the other. She had spent the last day convincing herself that the bond had meant nothing to him, that she could survive whatever happened next, by refusing to hope for anything better. Hearing him admit even a flicker of doubt threatened to undo all of that careful protection she had built around her heart. "It does not matter what you believe now," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "The pack has already seen you reject me. Even if you changed your mind today, it would look weak, and you cannot afford to look weak, not with everything happening around us." Cade studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You speak as though you understand exactly what it means to rule." "I understand what it means to watch someone choose their reputation over the truth," Alira replied. "I have seen it before, in smaller ways, in my own village. It is not so different here, only the stakes are higher, and the crown is heavier." Her words struck something deep within him, a truth he did not want to face but could not entirely deny. He had chosen his image, his authority, his fear of repeating his father's mistakes, over the quiet certainty of the bond pulling him toward her. He had let old wounds make a decision that belonged to his heart, and now he did not know how to undo it without appearing exactly as weak as she had described. "I will find the truth," Cade said finally, turning to leave. "About the poison, and about you." "And if the truth proves I am innocent," Alira asked softly, "will it matter? Or will your pride matter more than the mistake you have already made?" Cade did not answer. He simply walked away, leaving her alone once again, in the cold silence of her cell. her question echoing behind him, long after his footsteps had faded down the corridor. Outside, night had fully settled over the castle, and somewhere within its walls, the true source of the poison moved carefully through the shadows, adjusting a plan that had been set into motion long before Alira had ever arrived. Bastian, Cade's most trusted second-in-command, watched the events unfolding with quiet satisfaction from his private quarters. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had hoped. The pack was distracted, suspicious of an outsider, and completely unaware that the true threat to their king stood far closer than any of them realized. He had worked for years to build Cade's trust, patiently waiting for the right moment to weaken his position from within. The unexpected mate bond had presented an opportunity he had not anticipated, but had quickly learned to use to his advantage. If Alira took the blame for the poisoning, suspicion would remain far away from him, at least for a little while longer, long enough for him to finish what he had truly come to accomplish. He had no intention of letting anyone discover the truth before it was too late. 3 days later, a fourth wolf fell sick, and this time, the council demanded action. Alira heard the news from a young guard named Nolan, one of the few who had shown her any kindness during her time in the cell, quietly bringing her extra blankets when the nights grew too cold, sneaking her small pieces of bread when meals ran short. He told her, his voice low and worried, that the pack elders had gathered that morning, furious over the growing sickness, demanding a swift resolution before panic spread any further among the younger wolves. They want an execution, Nolan whispered through the bars. By tomorrow evening, if the king does not act. Alira's breath caught in her throat. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this possibility existed, yet hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, so soon, made the fear finally settle fully into her bones. "Does the king agree with them?" she asked. Nolan hesitated, his young face conflicted. He has not said, but the elders hold real power in matters like this, especially when pack safety is threatened. Even a king cannot ignore them forever. After Nolan left, Alira sat alone in the growing darkness of her cell, forcing herself to breathe slowly, steadily, refusing to let panic take control of her thoughts. She thought about Cade's visit 2 nights earlier, the flicker of doubt she had seen in his eyes, the quiet admission that he was no longer certain he had made the right choice. She wondered if that doubt would be enough to save her, or if pride and pressure from his counsel would win out in the end. She did not have long to wait for her answer. The following morning, Cade called an emergency meeting with his full council, including Callan, the pack elders, and several senior guards. Tension filled the meeting hall as elders argued loudly for immediate action, insisting that allowing the situation to continue unresolved only invited further danger. Callan, seated near Cade's right side, spoke calmly and persuasively, each word carefully chosen to steer the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. "My king," Callan said, his voice smooth and reasonable, "I understand your hesitation. None of us wish to act rashly, but 4 wolves have now fallen ill, including one of your own personal guards. The pack looks to you for protection, and right now, protection means removing the threat before a 5th wolf, or worse, falls victim to this poison." Cade sat silently for a long moment, his fingers pressed together, his expression carefully controlled despite the storm raging beneath the surface. Every instinct told him that something did not add up. If Alira had been the source of the poison, how had a new wolf fallen sick while she remained locked away with no possible access to the water supply? Yet each time he tried to voice this doubt, the elders dismissed it quickly, insisting that an accomplice must exist, someone working alongside her, delivering poison on her behalf even from within the castle walls. The theory felt convenient, too convenient perhaps. But convenient theories often gained traction quickly when fear ran high, and Cade could feel the tide of opinion turning firmly against Alira with each passing hour. "I want more time," Cade said finally, his voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "One more day, to properly investigate before any final decision is made." The elders exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unhappy with the delay, but none dared openly challenge their king's authority. Callan simply nodded, his expression unreadable, though something behind his calm exterior shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of impatience quickly hidden away. One day, that was all the time Cade had bought for Alira, and he intended to use every hour of it. He sought out Ren immediately after the meeting ended, finding her in the small healing hut near the eastern edge of the castle grounds, surrounded by shelves of dried herbs and old, worn healing texts. She looked up in surprise when he entered, quickly straightening, unused to receiving personal visits from her king. "Tell me everything you know about this illness," Cade said without preamble. "Everything, no matter how small it might seem." Ren hesitated only a moment before nodding, relieved to finally have someone in power, willing to listen to her concerns. She explained her earlier findings, the specific symptoms that pointed toward nightshade root, rather than a more common poison, the careful preparation required to use it effectively, the deep knowledge of the land necessary to gather and prepare it correctly. An outsider, someone unfamiliar with our territory, could not have easily obtained or prepared this poison, Ren explained. It requires specific knowledge, passed down only among healers, and those closely connected to the land itself. Cade absorbed this information slowly, feeling the fragile theory the elders had built against Alira begin to crack under the weight of simple, undeniable facts. "Why did you not share this sooner?" Ren's expression turned uneasy. "I did share it, my king. With Callan, 3 days ago. He told me he would handle the information personally." A cold, uncomfortable feeling settled deep in Cade's stomach. Callan had known this information and chosen not to share it, allowing the case against Alira to continue building unchecked. He tried to think of an innocent explanation, some reasonable excuse for the omission, but the longer he searched, the harder it became to find one. "Tell no one else what you have told me," Cade instructed Ren firmly. "Not yet. I need to understand more before I act." Ren nodded, though worry lined her young face. "My king, if I may ask, what do you plan to do?" Cade's jaw tightened, determination hardening his features. "I plan to find out exactly who has access to nightshade root within this pack, and why my most trusted advisor chose to hide crucial evidence from me during an investigation this serious." He left the healing hut with new purpose burning through the exhaustion that had weighed on him for days. For the first time since Alira's arrival, he felt as though the fog clouding his judgment had begun to lift, replaced by a clarity sharper and more focused than anything he had experienced in a very long time. He spent the remainder of the day quietly gathering information, speaking privately with guards, servants, and anyone else who might have noticed unusual behavior in the days leading up to the poisoning. Slowly, carefully, a picture began to form, one that pointed increasingly away from Alira and toward someone far closer to Cade himself. A stable hand mentioned seeing Bastian near the eastern well late one night, far outside his usual duties. A young servant recalled overhearing a hushed argument between Bastian and Callan, though she had not understood its meaning at the time. Individually, these small details meant little. Together, they painted a picture that made Cade's blood run cold with dawning realization. That evening, Cade made his way down to the holding cells once more, his mind racing with everything he had learned throughout the day. He found Alira sitting quietly on her narrow bench, her posture straight, despite clear exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She looked up as he approached, something cautious and guarded in her eyes, though she no longer flinched away from him the way she had during his previous visit. "I have new information," Cade said, keeping his voice low, "about the poison, and about who might truly be responsible." Alira's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering briefly, before she carefully controlled her expression, unwilling to trust it fully just yet. "What have you found?" Cade explained everything Ren had told him, the specific nature of the poison, the deep knowledge required to use it effectively, the strange behavior he had uncovered surrounding Bastian and Callan over the past several days. As he spoke, he watched relief slowly replace the guarded caution in her eyes, though it remained tempered by wariness, understandably unwilling to celebrate too soon. "Why are you telling me this?" Alira asked quietly when he finished. "You could simply continue the investigation without involving me at all." Cade hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you deserve to know the truth is finally being uncovered. And because I owe you an apology I do not know how to properly give." Something in Alira's chest tightened painfully at his words. Part of her wanted desperately to accept the apology, to let herself hope that everything might still be repaired between them. But another part, the part that remembered standing alone in a courtyard, while he condemned her in front of everyone, held back, unwilling to trust so easily again. "An apology will not undo what has already happened," she said softly. Even if you prove my innocence tomorrow, the pack has already seen you reject me, condemn me, believe the worst of me without hesitation. That cannot simply be erased with a few kind words spoken in private. Cade absorbed her words silently, understanding the painful truth behind them, even as it hurt to hear. You are right. I cannot undo what has already been done, but I can make certain the truth comes to light, and I can make certain those responsible face real consequences for what they have done. And what happens to me, once the truth is revealed? Illyra asked. Do I simply return to being your mate, as though none of this ever happened? Cade did not have an answer for her, not one that felt honest or complete. The bond between them still pulsed quietly beneath everything else, undeniable, despite all the pain and mistrust that had grown around it. But trust, once broken, did not repair itself simply because the truth finally came to light. He understood that now, understood it in a way that settled heavily, painfully, in his chest. I do not know, he admitted quietly, but I intend to spend whatever time it takes trying to find out. He left shortly after, his mind already turning toward the difficult task ahead of him, confronting Bastian and Callan with the evidence he had gathered, forcing the truth into the open before the Elder's deadline arrived the following evening. He did not yet know how dangerous that confrontation would prove to be, or how close he stood to losing everything he was only just beginning to understand mattered most to him. Back in her cell, Illyra sat alone once more, her heart a tangled mess of cautious hope and lingering pain. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to believe that the truth might actually save her, yet even as hope flickered gently in her chest, a quiet unease lingered alongside it, a small, persistent worry that the danger surrounding her had not yet reached its true and terrible peak. She was right to worry. Somewhere within the castle walls, Bastian had already learned that his carefully built plan was beginning to unravel, and desperate men, when cornered, often became the most dangerous of all. Bastian moved through the shadowed hallway with quick, controlled steps, his mind racing through every possible way his careful plan might have started to unravel. He had spent years building his position within the pack, earning trust, slowly, patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the foundation of Cade's rule. The poisoning had been meant as a small piece of a much larger plan, a distraction to weaken the pack's confidence in their king, while Bastian quietly moved other pieces into place. Illyra's unexpected arrival, and the mate bond that had formed so suddenly, had presented an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Blame her, let suspicion fall away from himself, and use the resulting chaos to further erode trust between Cade and his own instincts. But now, word had reached him that Cade had spoken privately with the healer, and worse, that servants had been questioned about his own movements near the eastern well. The walls were closing in far faster than he had anticipated. He found Callan waiting in a small private study near the western wing of the castle, pacing anxiously by the fireplace. Callan turned sharply when Bastian entered, his usually composed expression cracked with visible worry. He knows, Callan said, without preamble, or close enough to it. He spoke with the healer today, and I have heard he questioned several servants about your whereabouts recently. Bastian's jaw tightened, though he forced his voice to remain steady. Then we adjust the plan. We move faster than intended. Faster how? Callan demanded, his composure slipping further. We are already exposed. If Cade uncovers proof connecting either of us to the poisoning, we lose everything. Our positions, our freedom, possibly our lives. Then we ensure he never gets the chance to act on whatever proof he thinks he has found, Bastian said coldly. Callan's eyes widened slightly, understanding the dark implication behind Bastian's words. You cannot mean to move against the king himself. That is treason of the highest order, an act that would unite every pack against us the moment it became known. I do not intend for it to become known, Bastian replied calmly. Accidents happen, even to kings, especially kings distracted and weakened by matters of the heart. A cold, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Callan had agreed to help Bastian sow doubt and chaos within the pack, believing it would ultimately benefit them both through subtler means, weakened trust, shifted alliances, careful manipulation over time. He had not agreed to outright treason against the very king he had sworn loyalty to for years. I want no part of this, Callan said finally, his voice firmer than Bastian had expected. Poisoning water to create fear and suspicion is one matter. Harming the king directly is another entirely. Bastian studied him for a long, tense moment, calculating quickly how much of a threat Callan's hesitation now posed to his plans. You are already involved, whether you wish to be or not. If I fall, you fall with me. Consider that carefully before deciding where your loyalty truly lies. Callan said nothing further, though something in his expression suggested the threat had landed exactly as Bastian intended. Fear, Bastian knew well, could be an even more powerful motivator than ambition. Meanwhile, Cade spent the evening reviewing everything he had learned throughout the day, carefully organizing the pieces of evidence into a clear and undeniable picture. He called Nolan, the young guard who had shown Alira small kindnesses during her imprisonment, into his private study, trusting his instincts about the young wolf's genuine loyalty. I need eyes on Bastian tonight, Cade instructed quietly, discreetly. Do not confront him, do not let him know he is being watched. Simply observe, and report back to me immediately, if anything unusual occurs. Nolan nodded firmly, honored by the trust his king had placed in him, despite his relatively junior position within the guard. I will not fail you, my king. As Nolan left to carry out his task, Cade turned his attention to a stack of old records, detailing herb usage and healing practices within the pack over the past several years. He searched carefully for any prior instance of nightshade root being requested or used, hoping to trace a clearer connection to whoever had orchestrated the poisoning. The task proved slow and tedious, but Cade forced himself to remain patient, understanding that rushing now, when he stood so close to uncovering the full truth, could easily lead him to make a fatal misstep. Hours passed slowly. Just as exhaustion began to weigh heavily on his eyes, Nolan returned, his young face pale and urgent. My king, you must come quickly, he said breathlessly. I followed Bastian to the eastern watchtower. He met with Callan, and I overheard enough of their conversation to understand that they are planning something dangerous, something involving you directly. Cade rose immediately, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by sharp, focused alertness. Tell me exactly what you heard. Nolan quickly relayed the conversation he had overheard, careful to include every detail he could recall. The mention of accidents, the reference to Cade being distracted and weakened, the clear implication of danger aimed directly at their king. Cade listened silently, his expression darkening with each word, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking firmly into place. Bastian, a man he had trusted for years, someone he had considered almost a brother in arms, stood revealed as a traitor, willing to endanger the entire pack, and now willing to move directly against Cade himself, all to protect a scheme built on lies and poison. Gather a small group of guards you trust completely, Cade instructed Nolan firmly. We move against Bastian tonight, before he has the chance to act further. As Nolan hurried to carry out his orders, Cade allowed himself one brief moment to process the weight of the betrayal he had just uncovered. Bastian's actions explained so much, the convenient timing of the poisoning, the suspicious behavior near the well, even Callan's strange reluctance to share Ren's crucial findings earlier. Yet amid the anger and disbelief, one thought rose above all others, sharp and insistent. Alira. She had been innocent from the very beginning, exactly as she had claimed, standing firm and dignified even as an entire pack turned against her based on lies crafted by men seeking to protect their own dangerous ambitions. Guilt settled heavily in Cade's chest, mingling uncomfortably with the urgency of the danger still unfolding around him. He had rejected her, imprisoned her, allowed his own pack to nearly condemn her to death, all because he had chosen suspicion over trust, old wounds over the truth standing plainly before him. He promised himself, silently and fiercely, that he would make this right, whatever it took, as soon as the immediate danger had been fully dealt with. He gathered his own weapons quickly, preparing to lead the effort to confront Bastian personally. As he moved through the castle corridors, his mind raced through every possible outcome of the coming confrontation, each one weighed carefully against the safety of his pack, and, though he barely allowed himself to fully acknowledge it, the safety of the woman locked away in the cells below, the woman he now understood, with painful clarity, he had wronged so deeply. Outside, in the eastern watchtower, Bastian sensed the shift in the air, some instinctive warning that time had run out far sooner than he had anticipated. He turned to Callan, his expression hardening with cold determination. We move now, he said. Tonight. Callan hesitated only a moment before nodding, fear overriding whatever reluctance remained within him. Whatever loyalty he had once held toward Cade had crumbled entirely beneath the weight of his own self-preservation. Together, they slipped out into the darkness, unaware that Cade already knew the truth, and that guards loyal to their king moved swiftly to intercept them before their plan could unfold any further. The night stretched on, tense and heavy with impending danger, as two very different groups moved through the shadows of the castle grounds, one seeking to protect a truth finally uncovered, the other desperately trying to bury it before it could destroy everything they had worked so carefully to build. By the time Cade and his guards reached the eastern watchtower, it stood empty, only a single overturned lantern left swinging gently in the night breeze. Cade's stomach tightened with growing dread. Nolan searched the surrounding area quickly, his young face tense with worry. "They knew we were coming, my king. This was too easy to find, too easy to reach." Cade's mind raced, quickly piecing together the uncomfortable truth. Bastion had years of experience within this pack, years of understanding exactly how information traveled, how quickly word could spread among guards and servants alike. It was entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that the conversation Nolan had overheard had been staged deliberately, a diversion meant to pull Cade and his most loyal guards away from the castle at exactly the moment they were needed elsewhere. "The elders," Cade said suddenly, cold realization washing over him. "They meet again at dawn, to finalize the decision about Alira's fate. If Bastion and Callan wanted us distracted tonight, it would be to ensure nothing interferes with that meeting." He turned immediately, already moving back toward the castle at a hard run, his guards following closely behind. The night sky had begun to lighten faintly at its edges, the first pale hints of dawn creeping over the horizon, and Cade felt every passing second like a blade pressed against his throat. They arrived back at the castle just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, and Cade's blood turned to ice the moment he saw the courtyard already filling with pack members, murmuring anxiously among themselves. The elders stood gathered near the platform, their expressions grim and resolute, and beside them, held firmly between two guards, stood Alira. "Stop this immediately," Cade shouted, pushing through the gathering crowd toward the platform. One of the eldest council members, a stern woman named Miriam, who had served the pack for decades, turned to face him with an expression of weary determination. "My king, forgive us, but we could not locate you this morning, and the deadline you yourself set has now passed. A fifth wolf fell ill only hours ago. The pack demands resolution, and as elders, we hold the authority to act when the king cannot be found in matters of urgent pack safety." "I have new evidence," Cade said urgently, forcing himself to speak calmly, despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Evidence that proves Alira is innocent, and reveals the true culprit behind this poisoning." Miriam's expression flickered with uncertainty, clearly torn between her loyalty to her king and the fear that had gripped the pack for days. "What evidence, my king? We cannot delay further based on assurances alone, not when lives continue to be at risk." Cade opened his mouth to explain everything Wren had told him, everything Nolan had overheard, but before he could speak further, a commotion broke out near the edge of the courtyard. Callan appeared, breathless and disheveled, clutching a rolled parchment in his trembling hands. "My king, forgive the interruption," Callan called out, his voice carrying false urgency across the courtyard. "But I have discovered something troubling, a written confession, found hidden among the prisoner's few belongings, detailing her involvement with agents of the Blackthorn pack." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cade's eyes narrowed sharply, understanding immediately that the parchment was almost certainly forged, another piece of Bastion and Callan's carefully constructed deception, timed perfectly to counter whatever evidence Cade might present. Yet the damage had already been done. Fear and confusion swept through the gathered pack members, drowning out the fragile doubt Cade had been trying to build. "That confession is false," Cade said firmly, his voice rising above the growing murmur of the crowd. "Produced by the very people responsible for the poisoning, in an attempt to protect themselves from discovery." "And what proof do you have of that, my king?" Callan asked smoothly, his composure fully restored despite the earlier panic in his voice. "A story from a young, inexperienced guard, and the theories of a healer who admits herself that certainty remains difficult in cases such as this? Against a written confession, discovered in the prisoner's own possession?" Cade felt the ground shifting dangerously beneath him, the careful case he had built overnight crumbling under the weight of Callan's calculated counterattack. He glanced toward Elira, standing silently between her guards, her expression calm despite the chaos swirling around her. Something in her eyes, steady and resigned, struck him deeply, a quiet acceptance that broke his heart, even as it strengthened his resolve to fight for her. "Bring Wren forward," Cade demanded. "Let her explain her findings, directly to the council and the pack, in full detail." A guard hurried to retrieve Wren, but as precious minutes ticked by, Miriam and the other elders exchanged increasingly uneasy glances, the pressure of a frightened, restless pack weighing heavily upon them. By the time Wren finally arrived, breathless and confused at being summoned so suddenly, Callan had already used the delay to further sway the crowd, subtly reminding them of every sick wolf, every night of fear, every reason they had to want this uncertainty resolved swiftly and decisively. Wren explained her findings as clearly as she could, detailing the specific nature of the poison, the deep knowledge required to prepare and use it effectively, the impossibility of an outsider unfamiliar with the land accomplishing such a task alone. Yet even as she spoke, Cade could see doubt and fear had already taken firm root among the gathered pack members, made worse by exhaustion, worry for their sick, and the persuasive, calculated calm of Callan's counter-arguments. "Even if the healer's theory holds truth," Miriam said slowly, clearly torn but unwilling to risk further delay, "it does not disprove the confession found among the prisoner's belongings. Perhaps she had help, an accomplice familiar with our land, working alongside her." Cade felt desperation clawing at his chest as he watched the narrative shift subtly but unmistakably away from Elira's innocence and back toward doubt and suspicion. He looked toward Elira again, and this time, she met his gaze steadily, something quiet and resigned passing silently between them. "Cade," she said softly, using his name directly for the first time since her initial rejection, "it is enough. You tried. That is more than I expected, more than I believed you capable of, after everything that happened." "No," Cade said fiercely, turning back toward the elders. "I will not allow this. I am your king, and I say the execution does not proceed until a full and proper investigation is completed." But even as he spoke the words, movement near the edge of the courtyard caught his attention. Bastian himself had appeared, positioned carefully among a group of pack members, his expression carrying practiced concern rather than the guilt Cade knew lay hidden beneath. "My king," Bastian called out, his voice steady and respectful. "Forgive my boldness, but the pack has suffered greatly these past days. Perhaps, given the confession discovered and the continued illness spreading among us, it would ease the fears of our people if the sentence were carried out today, allowing us all to move forward and heal together as one pack once more." Murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd, exhausted and frightened people, desperate for any resolution, any sense that the danger threatening their families had finally come to an end. Cade felt control of the situation, slipping further away with each passing moment. The careful truth he had uncovered overnight, drowned beneath fear, forged evidence, and Bastian's calculated manipulation of a desperate crowd. "I forbid it," Cade said, his voice hard and final. "I am your king, and my word stands above the council's in matters such as this." Miriam stepped forward, her expression heavy with reluctant duty. "My king, with great respect, pack law allows the council to act in matters of immediate safety when the king's judgment appears compromised by personal matters. Your bond with the prisoner is well known throughout the pack. Many wonder if that bond clouds your judgment now, much as it clouded your rejection of her only days ago." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Cade opened his mouth to argue further, but Elira's quiet voice cut through the rising tension before he could speak. "Let it happen," she said softly, yet clearly enough for those nearby to hear. Cade turned to her, disbelief and desperation warring across his features. "Elira, no. I will not allow this. You cannot stop this without tearing your pack apart from within," Elira said, her voice steady, despite the fear that must have lingered somewhere beneath her calm exterior. "I have watched you these past days, Cade. I understand now what kind of king you are trying to be, torn between duty and truth, between old wounds and new understanding. If I fight this now, if you fight this now, it destroys everything you have built, everything your people trust in you to protect." "Your life matters more than my position," Cade said fiercely. though his voice cracked slightly with the weight of everything unraveling around them. "Perhaps," Illyra said, something soft and sad flickering behind her steady gaze. "But it is not only your position at stake. It is the trust an entire pack places in their king, to act wisely, even when it costs him deeply. I would rather you remain the king your people need, even if it costs me everything, than watch you tear yourself, and them, apart trying to save someone who might already be too far gone to save." Cade felt something inside him break entirely at her words, a devastating mixture of love, grief, and helpless fury at a situation spiraling far beyond his control. He turned back toward the elders, toward Bastion and Callan, standing calmly among the frightened crowd, and understood, with sickening clarity, exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. He had uncovered the truth too late, or perhaps not thoroughly enough, not fast enough, not with enough undeniable proof to overcome fear, forged evidence, and years of careful manipulation. Miriam looked toward him one final time, offering him one last chance to produce something, anything, capable of stopping what had already been set into unstoppable motion. When Cade remained silent, his mind desperately searching for an answer that would not come in time, she nodded slowly, sorrow evident in her aged eyes despite her unwavering sense of duty. "Bring the silver poison," she said quietly. Ren's hands trembled as she carried the small silver cup across the courtyard, every step feeling heavier than the last. As the pack's healer, the grim duty of preparing the poison had fallen to her, a responsibility she desperately wished she could refuse. She had argued quietly with Miriam only minutes earlier, insisting again that her findings pointed clearly away from Illyra's guilt, but the elder had simply shaken her head, explaining that pack law required proceeding once a formal decision had been reached, regardless of any healer's private doubts. Ren caught Illyra's eye briefly as she approached the platform, and something passed silently between them. An unspoken apology, an unspoken understanding that neither of them had the power to stop what was about to happen. Cade stood frozen near the edge of the platform, his mind racing desperately for any possible solution, any argument capable of halting the proceedings even now, at this final, terrible moment. But every path he considered led only to further chaos, further division within his pack, exactly the outcome Bastion had clearly hoped to achieve from the very beginning. He caught Bastion's eye briefly across the courtyard and saw, hidden carefully beneath a mask of solemn concern, the faintest flicker of satisfaction. The realization settled like ice through Cade's veins. Bastion had won, at least for now, using fear and forged evidence to accomplish exactly what he had set out to do from the start, weakening Cade's authority and eliminating a potential threat to his continued deception, all without ever needing to lift a weapon himself. Illyra stood calmly at the center of the platform, her posture straight, her expression composed despite the fate awaiting her. She looked out over the gathered crowd, faces filled with a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and grim resolve, and felt, strangely, a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had spent her entire life believing that finding her true mate would bring safety, belonging, a sense of finally being seen and understood by someone who mattered. Instead, she had found suspicion, rejection, and now, a poisoned end forced upon her by fear and manipulation she had never had the power to fully fight against. Yet even now, she did not feel the crushing despair she might have expected. Instead, she felt only a tired, resigned clarity. She had told the truth from the very beginning. She had refused to beg, refused to grovel, before people who had already decided her guilt before she ever spoke a single word in her own defense. Whatever happened next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything since her arrival, with quiet dignity intact, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Ren reached the platform and offered the small silver cup with visibly shaking hands. Illyra accepted it calmly, studying the pale, shimmering liquid within for a brief moment, before lifting her gaze to meet Cade's eyes one final time. Something passed between them in that silent moment, a final, wordless conversation neither of them would ever fully be able to explain to anyone else. Cade wanted desperately to call out, to stop everything even now, consequences be damned. Yet the crushing weight of Illyra's earlier words held him frozen in place. She had asked him to remain the king his people needed. She had asked him not to tear everything apart trying to save her. He understood, with devastating clarity, that stepping in now would only prove Miriam's earlier accusation correct, confirming to his entire pack that his judgment truly had been compromised beyond reason. Yet as he watched her lift the cup slowly toward her lips, every instinct within him screamed that remaining silent was the greatest mistake of his entire life. Elira smiled. It was small, barely visible to most of the crowd watching from a distance, but Cade, standing close enough to see clearly, felt his entire world shatter at the sight of it. It was not a smile of fear, nor even resignation exactly. It held something far more complicated, a quiet acceptance mixed with something achingly close to relief, as though some part of her welcomed an ending to the pain and uncertainty that had consumed her since the moment their mate bond had first formed. She drank. The courtyard fell utterly silent as she lowered the empty cup, her expression remaining calm, even as the poison began its slow, terrible work through her body. She swayed slightly, her knees weakening beneath her, yet she did not cry out, did not beg for help, did not show any outward sign of the pain that must have been building rapidly within her. Cade moved before he fully realized what he was doing, rushing forward to catch her as her legs finally gave way beneath her. He lowered her gently to the platform, cradling her carefully against his chest, his composure shattering entirely in front of his entire watching pack. "Elira," he whispered, his voice breaking with raw, undisguised grief. "Elira, please." Her eyes fluttered, struggling to remain focused on his face, despite the poison rapidly spreading through her system. "I told you," she whispered faintly, her voice barely audible even to him. "I never lied to you, Cade, not once." "I know," he said desperately, pressing his forehead against hers, uncaring now of how it appeared to the crowd watching in stunned silence around them. "I know, and I am so sorry. I should have trusted you from the very beginning." A faint, sad smile touched her lips once more, fainter now, weaker, yet still somehow filled with that same quiet peace that had unsettled him so deeply only moments earlier. "It is all right," she murmured. "At least now, you finally believe me." Her eyes closed slowly, her body growing still within his arms, and for one horrifying, endless moment, Cade believed he had truly lost her forever, right there in front of his entire pack, mere moments after finally understanding the depth of the terrible mistake he had made. Ren rushed forward immediately, pressing trembling fingers against Elira's throat, searching desperately for any sign of a pulse. The crowd remained utterly silent, holding a collective breath as they waited to learn the outcome of everything that had just unfolded before them. Cade barely breathed, his entire world narrowed down to the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, Ren might find some sign of life still remaining within the still, pale figure held carefully in his arms. "There is no pulse," Ren said quietly, her voice barely steady enough to carry across the silent courtyard. "I am sorry, my king. She is gone." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd, but Cade heard none of it clearly, the words echoing distantly, as though spoken from somewhere far away. He held Elira's still form against his chest, refusing to release her, refusing to accept the finality of Ren's quiet announcement. "Check again," he said, his voice raw and desperate. "Please, check again." Ren hesitated only a moment before pressing her fingers once more against the side of Elira's throat, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm of emotion clearly churning beneath her composed exterior. She held her breath, waiting several long seconds before finally shaking her head slowly. "I am sorry," she repeated softly. What none of the watching crowd could see, hidden carefully within the folds of Elira's clothing, was Ren's other hand pressed gently against her chest, feeling the faint, fluttering rhythm of a heartbeat so weak it barely registered at all. It was there, undeniably present, though so faint that anyone without a healer's carefully trained senses might easily miss it entirely. Ren had suspected, from the very beginning of the investigation, that something about this entire situation reeked of manipulation, far beyond a simple case of poisoning. She had quietly prepared for exactly this possibility over the past several days, carefully substituting a small portion of the true silver poison with a weaker, similar-looking substance capable of inducing a deep, death-like unconsciousness rather than an actual, permanent end. It would not fully protect Elira from harm. The substance still carried real danger, real pain, and a slow, difficult recovery ahead if she survived at all. but it offered a chance, however small, a possibility Ren had felt desperately compelled to create, the moment she understood how thoroughly this entire situation had been manipulated by forces far more dangerous than a simple, sick prisoner. She had told no one of her plan, not even Nolan, understanding that the fewer people who knew the truth, the safer Alira would remain from those determined to see her permanently silenced. Now, watching Cade's raw, unguarded grief pouring out in front of his entire pack, Ren felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over her. She wanted desperately to tell him the truth, to ease the crushing weight of loss so plainly written across his devastated features. But doing so now, in front of Bastion and Callan, in front of a crowd still processing everything that had just unfolded, would almost certainly place Alira in even greater danger than she already faced. If Bastion believed his plan had truly succeeded, he might grow careless, confident, giving Cade the opening he needed to finally expose the full truth, without further risk to Alira's fragile hidden survival. So Ren remained silent, carrying the heavy burden of her secret alone, watching Cade's world collapse around him, without any way to offer immediate comfort. "Take her to be prepared properly," Ren said gently, addressing Cade directly. "My king, please, let me care for her now." Cade looked up at her, his golden eyes filled with a devastation so complete, it nearly broke Ren's careful composure entirely. Slowly, reluctantly, he allowed 2 guards to help lift Alira's still form from his arms, watching helplessly as they carried her toward the healing hut, under Ren's careful direction. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring quietly among themselves, some offering awkward, uncertain condolences toward their visibly shattered king, others simply retreating in uncomfortable silence, unwilling to intrude further on such raw, public grief. Miriam approached Cade cautiously, her expression heavy with regret despite the duty she had carried out. "My king," she said quietly, "I am truly sorry it came to this. If your evidence had arrived sooner, perhaps—" "Do not," Cade said, his voice hollow and distant. "Do not offer excuses now. It changes nothing." Miriam nodded solemnly, retreating without further argument, understanding the futility of offering comfort to a grief this raw, this complete. Across the courtyard, Bastion watched the scene unfold with carefully hidden satisfaction, though even he found himself slightly unsettled by the sheer weight of devastation visible in Cade's usually controlled demeanor. He had expected relief, perhaps some lingering guilt quickly buried beneath the demands of ruling a pack, not this raw, public collapse of a king normally so composed and controlled. Still, the outcome served his purposes well enough. Suspicion had been fully deflected away from him, at least for now, and Cade's obvious grief would likely keep him distracted and vulnerable for some time to come. Precisely the kind of vulnerability Bastion intended to exploit further, as his larger plans continued to unfold. He exchanged a brief, subtle glance with Callan across the thinning crowd, silently confirming that their immediate crisis had been successfully navigated. Callan looked pale and shaken, clearly troubled by how close everything had come to unraveling entirely, but he offered a small, reluctant nod in response, understanding that retreat now would only invite further suspicion. Neither of them noticed Nolan watching them carefully from a distance, his young face carefully neutral, despite the sharp suspicion building steadily within him. He had not fully trusted the confession Callan had produced so conveniently, and the subtle exchange of glances he had just witnessed between the 2 men only deepened his growing certainty that something remained deeply wrong beneath the surface of everything that had just occurred. He resolved quietly to continue watching them both, determined to uncover whatever remained hidden beneath the carefully constructed lies that had led to such a devastating, public tragedy. Meanwhile, in the quiet privacy of the healing hut, Ren worked quickly and carefully, once the door had been firmly closed behind her, ensuring complete privacy, before beginning the delicate, dangerous work of stabilizing Alira's weakened body. She administered a careful combination of herbs, designed to counter the effects of the substance still working through Alira's system, her hands moving with practiced precision, despite the trembling anxiety she felt building steadily beneath her calm exterior. Hours passed slowly as Ren monitored Alira's condition carefully, watching for any sign of improvement, any indication that her carefully calculated gamble might actually succeed. Late into the night, as exhaustion finally began to overwhelm her, Ren felt a faint, encouraging flutter beneath her fingertips, Alira's pulse growing slightly stronger, slightly steadier than it had been only hours earlier. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by renewed determination. Alira was not out of danger yet, not by any measure, but she was alive, and as long as she remained alive, hope remained alive alongside her. Ren understood the difficult path still stretching ahead. She would need to keep Alira's survival a closely guarded secret for as long as possible, caring for her quietly while continuing to gather evidence against Bastion and Callan, hoping desperately that the truth could be fully and safely exposed before anyone discovered that her earlier declaration of death had been nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, one designed to protect a woman who deserved so much better than the suffering forced upon her by men consumed entirely by their own selfish ambitions. Grief changed Cade in ways his pack had never witnessed before. In the days following Alira's apparent death, he withdrew almost entirely from public duties, spending long hours alone in his private chambers, staring blankly at the same tall window where he had once stood contemplating the bond he had refused to fully accept. Servants whispered quietly among themselves, worried by the visible toll grief had taken on their normally composed and controlled king. He barely ate, he barely slept. When he did speak, his voice carried a hollow, distant quality that unsettled everyone who heard it. Callan attempted several times to draw him back into pack matters, insisting gently that the pack needed strong, visible leadership, now more than ever, especially with tensions still lingering from the recent poisoning crisis. Each time, Cade dismissed him with barely restrained impatience, unable to summon the energy required to focus on anything beyond the crushing weight of his own guilt and loss. Nolan, meanwhile, continued his quiet investigation into Bastion and Callan's suspicious behavior, carefully gathering small pieces of evidence whenever opportunities arose. He noticed subtle inconsistencies in Callan's account of discovering the confession parchment, timing that did not quite align with witness accounts of his movements that morning. He observed Bastion meeting privately with several guards known for their loyalty to Coin, rather than genuine conviction, conversations that ended abruptly whenever anyone approached too closely. Slowly, carefully, Nolan began compiling a case of his own, separate from anything Cade had gathered before the execution, determined to bring the full truth into the open, regardless of how long it might take. Ren, meanwhile, continued her secret work, caring for Alira, who remained unconscious for nearly a full week following the incident in the courtyard. She moved Alira to a small, hidden chamber beneath the healing hut, rarely used and known to almost no one within the castle, accessible only through a carefully concealed passage she had discovered years earlier while studying under the previous pack healer. She visited whenever she could safely slip away unnoticed, carefully tending to Alira's slow, difficult recovery, while maintaining her public performance of quiet, grieving healer who had failed to save a patient. The guilt of watching Cade's devastating grief, without offering him any comfort, weighed heavily on Ren with each passing day. She understood the necessity of her continued silence, understood that revealing Alira's survival too soon could easily place her back in mortal danger if Bastion or Callan learned the truth before their guilt had been fully and safely exposed. Yet watching her king slowly crumble under grief, she alone possessed the power to ease, felt like its own quiet form of cruelty, one she reluctantly accepted as necessary, but never grew comfortable carrying. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the execution, Alira finally opened her eyes fully, for the first time since collapsing in the courtyard. Confusion and weakness clouded her thoughts initially, her memories returning slowly, painfully, as understanding of everything that had happened gradually settled back into place. "Where am I?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible even in the quiet stillness of the hidden chamber. Ren rushed to her side immediately, relief flooding through her at the sight of Alira's clear, conscious eyes, finally meeting her own. "You are safe," she said softly. "Hidden, but safe. You have been unconscious for nearly 2 weeks." Alira absorbed this information slowly, memories of the courtyard, the silver cup, Cade's devastated face pressed against her own as darkness closed in around her, returning gradually with painful clarity. "The poison. I remember drinking it. I remember believing I was dying." "You very nearly did," Ren admitted quietly. "I substituted a portion of the poison with something weaker at the last moment, hoping to give you a chance at survival. It was a desperate gamble, and I am deeply relieved it succeeded, though your recovery remains fragile and will require continued care." Tears welled unexpectedly in Alira's eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of emotion following such a devastating, uncertain ordeal. Does Cade know? Does he understand I survived? Ren's expression turned troubled, careful and measured. No. He believes you died in the courtyard that day. I have not told him the truth, not yet. It remains too dangerous, both for you and potentially for him, until we can fully expose the men truly responsible for everything that happened. Illyra absorbed this painful information slowly, understanding the difficult necessity behind Ren's careful decision, even as it deepened the ache already settled heavily within her chest. She thought of Cade, grieving somewhere within the castle above her, believing he had truly lost her, carrying the crushing weight of a guilt he did not need to bear any longer than absolutely necessary. How long must this continue? She asked softly. Until we have enough evidence to ensure your safety, once the truth comes out, Ren said gently. Nolan has been gathering information carefully these past 2 weeks. Once we have enough to expose Bastion and Callan beyond any possible doubt, we can finally reveal everything, safely and completely. Illyra nodded slowly, understanding, despite the painful ache of continued separation, from a man she had come to care for, far more deeply than she had ever expected, given everything that had unfolded between them since their very first meeting. She thought about his devastated expression in her final clear memory, the raw grief and desperate apology he had offered, as darkness closed in around her, and found herself hoping, quietly and fiercely, that the day would come soon, when she could finally ease that terrible burden of guilt he carried so heavily upon himself. Above them, within the castle, Cade continued his slow, painful unraveling, unaware that the woman he grieved so deeply remained alive, hidden carefully beneath the very ground he walked each day, waiting patiently for the moment when truth and justice would finally allow them to find their way back to one another once more. 3 weeks after the execution, Nolan finally gathered enough evidence to act. He had spent countless hours piecing together a careful timeline of Bastion and Callan's movements, cross-referencing witness accounts, tracking down a stable hand willing to formally testify about seeing Bastion near the eastern well on the night the poisoning began, and even locating a servant who had witnessed Callan forging documents late one night in his private study, documents that matched the handwriting found on the false confession presented during Illyra's trial. Individually, each piece of evidence might have been dismissed or explained away. Together, presented clearly and completely, they formed an undeniable case that no amount of clever manipulation could easily overcome. Nolan brought everything he had gathered directly to Ren first, understanding instinctively that she remained one of the few people within the castle he could fully trust with such sensitive information. Ren listened carefully to everything he presented, her expression growing increasingly resolute as the full scope of Bastion and Callan's betrayal became undeniably clear. "This is enough," she said firmly once he finished. "More than enough. It is time to bring this directly to the king." "Will he believe it, given everything that has already happened?" Nolan asked, genuine worry evident in his young voice. "He has withdrawn so completely these past weeks. I worry he may no longer trust his own judgment enough to act decisively, even with clear evidence presented before him." Ren considered this carefully, understanding the valid concern behind Nolan's hesitation. Cade's grief had indeed left him distant and withdrawn, a shadow of the composed, decisive king he had been before Illyra's arrival. Yet Ren also understood something Nolan did not yet know, a secret that might prove powerful enough to fully restore Cade's determination and focus when the moment finally came to reveal it. "Bring the evidence to him," Ren said finally. "I will be there as well. Trust me, Nolan. He will act, and act decisively, once he understands the full truth." Together, they requested an urgent private audience with Cade, later that same evening. He received them in his private study, his appearance still visibly worn by weeks of grief, though something in his eyes sharpened slightly upon seeing the serious, determined expressions both Nolan and Ren carried with them. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice carrying a faint echo of the authority that had once defined him so completely. Nolan laid out the evidence carefully, methodically, explaining each piece and how it connected to build an undeniable case against Bastion and Callan's guilt in orchestrating the poisoning and the false confession used to condemn Illyra. Cade listened in tense, controlled silence, his expression darkening steadily as the full scope of the betrayal became clear before him. When Nolan finished, a heavy silence settled over the room. Cade's hands curled into tight fists at his sides, a familiar fire returning to his golden eyes for the first time in weeks, grief slowly transforming into something sharper, more focused, more dangerous. "They will answer for this," Cade said, his voice low and hard. "Tonight." "My king," Ren said quietly, stepping forward before he could move further. "There is something else you must know, something I have kept hidden until now, for reasons I hope you will understand once I explain fully." Cade turned toward her sharply, sensing the weight behind her careful words. "What is it?" Ren took a steadying breath, understanding the enormity of what she was about to reveal. "Elira is alive." The words hung in the air for a long, stunned moment, Cade's expression shifting rapidly through disbelief, confusion, and finally, a desperate, fragile hope he barely dared to allow himself to feel. "What did you say?" he whispered. Ren explained everything quickly, the substitution she had made at the last moment, the careful, secret recovery she had overseen these past 3 weeks, the necessity of keeping the truth hidden until Bastion and Callan's guilt could be fully and safely exposed. Cade listened in stunned silence, tears he had not allowed himself to shed in weeks, finally threatening to spill over as relief and renewed hope crashed through him with overwhelming force. "Take me to her," he said immediately, his voice raw with desperate emotion. "Soon," Ren promised gently, "but first, we must deal with Bastion and Callan properly. If they learn she survived before we are fully prepared to expose them, they may attempt something even more desperate and dangerous than before." Cade forced himself to nod, understanding the wisdom behind her caution, despite the overwhelming urgency burning through him, to see Elira with his own eyes immediately. "Then let us finish this tonight, so I can go to her without further delay." Together, the three of them quickly finalized a plan to confront Bastion and Callan publicly, ensuring the evidence would be presented clearly before the full Pack Council, leaving no room for further manipulation or forged documents to muddy the undeniable truth. The confrontation took place later that same night, in the same council hall where Elira's fate had once been so unjustly decided. Cade presented the evidence himself, his voice steady and commanding, restored fully to the composed authority his pack remembered from before the crisis had begun. Miriam and the other elders listened with growing horror as the full scope of Bastion and Callan's betrayal became undeniably clear. Forged documents, false confessions, a carefully orchestrated poisoning meant to weaken pack unity and eliminate an innocent woman entirely for the sake of protecting their own dangerous ambitions. Bastion attempted denial at first, then desperate justification, but the weight of evidence proved far too overwhelming to overcome. Callan, faced with the full collapse of their carefully constructed deception, broke down entirely, offering a full confession in a desperate, futile attempt to secure leniency for himself by placing the majority of blame squarely upon Bastion's shoulders. Guards moved quickly to detain both men, their treachery fully exposed before the entire assembled council. Miriam turned to Cade, her expression heavy with genuine sorrow and regret. "My king, we failed you, and we failed her, terribly," she said quietly. "I do not know how such an injustice can ever be properly repaired." "It cannot be fully repaired," Cade said honestly, his voice carrying quiet, hard-won wisdom. "But we can ensure it never happens again, and we can begin the long process of rebuilding the trust this pack has lost, both in its leadership and in one another." As guards led Bastion and Callan away to await proper judgment, Cade felt the crushing weight he had carried for 3 long weeks finally begin to lift, replaced by desperate, overwhelming eagerness to finally see Elira again, to finally hold her, and to finally begin making right everything that had gone so terribly, painfully wrong between them. Cade moved through the hidden passage beneath the healing hut, with his heart pounding harder than it ever had during any battle he had faced in his entire life. Ren led the way carefully, holding a small lantern to guide them through the narrow, winding tunnel toward the concealed chamber, where Elira had spent the past 3 weeks, slowly recovering from the ordeal that had nearly ended her life. Cade barely noticed the damp stone walls, or the low ceiling forcing him to duck slightly as he walked. His entire focus remained fixed on the small wooden door waiting at the tunnel's end, and whatever lay beyond it. Ren paused just before reaching the door, turning back to face him with a gentle, understanding expression. "She has grown stronger these past weeks, but her recovery remains ongoing. Please, Be patient with her, and with yourself. Cade nodded, though he barely trusted his own voice enough to respond aloud. Ren opened the door quietly and stepped inside first, and Cade followed close behind, his breath catching in his throat the moment his eyes finally found her. Elira sat propped up carefully against a small pile of cushions, her face still pale from weeks of recovery, yet unmistakably, wonderfully alive. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him standing in the doorway, disbelief and overwhelming emotion flooding across her features all at once. "Cade," she whispered, her voice trembling with the same disbelief he felt building within his own chest. He crossed the small room in only a few quick strides, kneeling carefully beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to gently cup her face, needing to feel the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers, needing undeniable proof that this was truly real, and not some cruel trick of his own grief-stricken imagination. "You are alive," he breathed, his voice breaking with overwhelming emotion. "I believed I had lost you forever. I have carried that guilt every single day since." "I know," Elira said softly, tears welling freely in her eyes now as well. "Ren told me everything, about your grief, about finally exposing the truth behind everything that happened to us." Cade pressed his forehead gently against hers, exactly as he had done in the courtyard weeks earlier, though this time, instead of desperate, hopeless grief, he felt only overwhelming, grateful relief. "I am so sorry, Elira, for rejecting you, for doubting you, for allowing fear and old wounds to blind me to the truth standing so clearly before me from the very beginning. I do not deserve a second chance, yet I find myself desperately hoping you might still consider giving me one." Elira studied him carefully, searching his face for any remaining trace of the doubt and suspicion that had caused so much pain between them. What she found instead was raw, unguarded honesty, a man who had been broken by grief and rebuilt through hard-won understanding, standing before her now fully willing to accept whatever consequences his earlier choices deserved. "You made a terrible mistake," she said quietly, honestly. "One that nearly cost me my life, and cost you weeks of unnecessary grief. I will not pretend that pain simply disappears, because the truth has finally come to light." "I understand," Cade said, though his heart ached painfully at her words. "But," Elira continued softly, a small, genuine smile beginning to form at the corners of her lips, "I also watched, even from within my hidden recovery, everything Ren told me about how hard you fought to uncover the truth, how deeply you grieved, how completely you were willing to sacrifice your own pride and position in order to seek justice on my behalf. That is not nothing, Cade. That matters deeply to me." Hope flickered cautiously back to life within Cade's chest at her words. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that trust, once broken, takes time to fully rebuild," Elira said gently. "But I am willing to try, if you are willing to prove, through your actions, rather than simply your words, that the man I bonded with, in that very first moment, truly exists, beneath all the fear and doubt that nearly destroyed us both." Relief and renewed hope flooded through Cade so powerfully that he felt momentarily unable to speak at all. Instead, he simply pulled her carefully into a gentle embrace, mindful of her continued fragile recovery, holding her close, as though he might never allow himself to let her go again. In the weeks that followed, as Elira's strength gradually returned, and word of Bastion and Callan's full betrayal spread throughout the pack, Cade worked tirelessly to rebuild both his pack's trust in his leadership and Elira's trust in him personally. He made her survival known publicly once she felt strong enough to face the pack again, and the pack, having witnessed his devastating grief and his relentless pursuit of justice on her behalf, welcomed her return with genuine warmth and quiet, heartfelt apologies for the fear and suspicion that had nearly cost her everything. Bastion and Callan faced formal judgment before the full council, their punishment severe and final, ensuring they would never again hold power to threaten the safety and unity of the pack they had so thoroughly betrayed. Slowly, patiently, day by day, Cade and Elira began rebuilding what had been so nearly destroyed between them, not rushing back into the bond they had once formed so suddenly, but allowing genuine trust and understanding to grow steadily in its place. Cade learned to listen more carefully, to question his own instincts before allowing old fears to dictate his decisions. Elira learned, slowly, to allow herself to hope again, to believe that the warmth she had first felt in that fateful first meeting had not been a mistake after all, simply a beginning that had needed far more care and patience than either of them had initially understood. Months later, standing together once more in the very same courtyard where everything had so nearly ended in tragedy, Cade took Alira's hands gently in his own, his golden eyes filled with a warmth and certainty that had never wavered once since the truth had finally come fully to light. "I once let fear cost me the most important thing I have ever found," he said softly, only for her ears. "I promise you now, with everything I am, that I will spend the rest of my life proving I have learned from that mistake." Alira smiled up at him, the same quiet, genuine smile that had once broken his heart in the very same courtyard, though now it carried nothing but warmth, hope, and the quiet promise of a future finally free from fear and doubt. "Then let us begin," she said softly. "Together, this time, from the very start." And as the golden light of a new dawn spread slowly across the courtyard, the pack that had once nearly torn itself apart through fear and betrayal watched their king and his true mate stand together at last, united fully in trust, in truth, and in the quiet, hard-won promise of a future built on far stronger foundations than the one that had so very nearly been lost forever.